Professor Sohail is the UNESCO Chair of Future Studies at UNESCO and USIM, and he's a political scientist and a futurist in the inaugural UNESCO Chair in the Future Studies. Sohail is also a professor at Tam Kang University in Taiwan and Associate Melbourne Business School, the University of Melbourne. Sohail has been teaching from the Meta Future School, and in March of 2011 he was awarded an honorary doctorate by University in Sands, Malaysia. Professor Sohail is the editor of the Globalization World Systems of UNESCO Encyclopedia for Life Support Systems, and is the author and co-editor of over 25 books, including Futures Thinking in Asia and Pacific Asia. So lots and lots of fantastic accomplishments to date, and we're really excited to hear the changes and challenges talk. So I'll hand it over to Sohail.
Just thrilled to be here. Thanks so much for the invite. Let me go to screen share. So what I want to do is talk for 20 minutes about Renaissance in all strata of life. As Megan said, COVID-19 has made many things much worse, but it's also opened up the door for possibilities. So I'd like to focus on both. So in terms of Renaissance, if you go back, there's been two historical Renaissances. One is the Asian Renaissance, which has almost been going in one steady stream, the Renaissance of the self, always trying to awaken one's own self within one's life journey. Then there was the stunning European Renaissance, which was about challenging church dogma in almost every possible way. And this was a political social Renaissance. And the term I use is borrowed from the philosopher P.R. Sarkar, and he says, well, actually, it's a Renaissance now in physical, social, and spiritual, Renaissance in three areas. So I'll stay focused on those three. Now, let me use Renaissance also in the word as power. Power not in the negative sense, but power in the creative sense. So in terms of the physical Renaissance, this is about imagining and creating a world where food, housing, education, health is possible for all globally. And the one thing COVID-19 has taught us that the money is there if central banks all coordinate. It's possible. It's not an impossible thing. It's possible. It was done quickly, and we know it can be done again. At the social level, the Renaissance is challenging power over. This is imagining a world where there's coordinated cooperation between gender, between countries, between regions, and very much trying to focus on a global tax to make sure wealth is distributed far more better, as well as far more peer-to-peer to encourage the creation of new wealth. Then there's a spiritual Renaissance. This is power over ourselves, service to others, a focus on the transcendental, and actually having a real practice, not just talking about the spirit. So this is three types of possible Renaissance in three different areas. Now I want to now shift a bit to make this personal. One of my teachers, William Irvin Thompson, who passed away recently, he said all scholarship is disguised autobiography. Meaning there's always ourself. We have a personal context in the worldview we believe and we take seriously and we act on. So I know when I met the founder of the National Geographic Project in Seattle about 15 years ago, and he told me about it, he said, why don't you try it out? And I did. And it showed my, I guess, my genetic heritage, where it moved from 50,000 years ago and where it traveled into South Asia, and of course the same gene type going into Australia. So this was very powerful, suggesting, of course, that we're all one. We're all from a similar space. Now, when I go into the personal stuff, we come from a little village in Punjab, and when I heard the person speak there, he talks about the genealogy going back hundreds of years ago, even 1,000 years ago. There was this sense of link to land, and I noticed how the names changed from Muslim names, then to Sikh names, then to Vedic names, indigenous names, and he just remembers all the names going back 1,000 years ago. There's a sense of grounding in history. So that grounding in a way creates almost this time that's stable. And at the same time, we know there's been dramatic changes. When I spoke to my father before he passed away, I asked him what were some of his memories, and he reminded me that his own grandmother died from starvation. Then I asked my mother about her grandmother, and she said, well, of course, she died from the bubonic plague when she was 18. And then when I asked about her mother, she said, well, her mother lost all her siblings, 6 of them, to smallpox. So there is a sense of deep insecurity going back 100 years ago. There's a sense the plague could hit you anytime. And of course, we're back in that world. Bubonic plague, smallpox, polio. And of course, with the Taliban advancing, we're back in that world as well, since they're the core anti-vaxxer group in the world. Now, at the same time, when I asked my grandmother, okay, there was a sense of plague and uncertainty, what changed that gave you some hope? And she's a very religious person, but she said what gave her hope was electricity, having a fridge. And that was one of those foundational things, that some things have stayed the same, and of course, some things have changed. Now, to go back now, recently, when I think about change, my mother, sister, brother, all in Pakistan, and they all got COVID. And both of them on life support systems. And I thought, well, what made the shift? How did they manage to survive? And one, of course, was thank you to the Chinese government. They made Sinopharm available, so she was vaccinated. The second, there was community. I was lucky to know Lisa Fraser, and she connected me with her teacher, Lama Tender. And that evening, they were having a Buddhist retreat and doing medicine Buddha. So I told my mother and sister, there's going to be most likely 50, 100 monks sending you microbiota spiritual energy. And the next morning, my sister woke up. She goes, something happened magical. She had messaged, should we turn off all the life support systems? And she said, everything is okay now. So for me, this was against the physical, social, and spiritual energy coming, but telling them, of course, this is happening, so placebo could occur, and of course, science, vaccinations, and being in a society where you're not alone, people are taking care of you. So now let's go back. I did the personal. Now, if we go back ourselves as a society, what was life like 50 years ago? When we were living in the US, there was something about put a tiger in your tank. And so there's this image of humble supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier. This was a considered power over nature. We can melt glaciers. Today, you can't do that. We know climate change is coming. The COVID-19 is just a little blip before the big blip comes. And yet today, it would be hard pressed for any corporation to say they love to melt glaciers. One of my teachers, Chris Stone, he wrote the book, Should Trees Have Standing? Given that humans won't protect nature, let's create legal systems where trees have standing in court. And New Zealand has led the way now. Not just New Zealand, and now there's been an avalanche of legal cases where Shell, Exxon, and Chevron and other climate change deniers have now legal responsibility. So if you see the dramatic shift in the last 50 years from let's all melt glaciers to no, we're responsible. If we look at other milestones, clearly the fall of the Berlin Wall, European Union, human genome, the rise of the internet, Asia financial crisis, bin Laden's attack on the Pentagon, SARS, which has come back, Ebola, GFC, etc. So our world has not been the same. It's changed dramatically. And of course, some things are the same. Now, as we think about the future, what are some possible pivots? In my world, in my work every day, a different organization, a different country asks for, tell us what's emerging. Where should we position ourselves? What should we do next week? What should we do the next 10 years? Now, listening to these kind of world thought leaders, I started to put together, yes, there's difficulties, but here's some possibilities. What might be some of these weak signals that may become large trees or may disappear? So 5 weak signals stand out. First is a project with the government of New Zealand, and they've started to say, let's focus the next 40 years from measuring GDP, goods and services, to well-being at physical and social levels. And we said, well, what does that mean? Well, what it means that in fact, infrastructure design is a way to create community health. Infrastructure design means real information available to citizens so they can make wiser decisions. Well-being means the mana of yourself is enhanced by lifting the mana of others. So this is a quite remarkable shift that they're experimenting, and I hope they'll lead the world, and I hope Australia by 2050 will catch up, maybe 2040 if we're lucky. But New Zealand leaves, eventually Prime Minister in Australia listens. So they're starting to imagine a sharing economy. And why is a sharing economy better? It's more efficient. Goods and services flow, and as they're shared, people feel more secure. There's a sense you will all have enough because everything is moving. It's not stuck, constipated in the few in Bezos or whoever you want to talk about. So it's moving far more quickly. This gets taken up by UNESCO and say, well, what do we want Asia to look like in 2040? The weak signal is we're the king of plastic. Let's become the garden of well-being, the garden of well-being. Now, of course, these are images. They're weak signals. It may still be the king of plastic, but the desire, the pull of national leaders and of citizens is to create something else. In every workshop I run, government of Abu Dhabi, government of Malaysia, this government, everyone says the same thing. We cannot continue in the 9-to-5 world. It's home plus office. It's not hours-based, it's outcomes-based. Someone said, let's imagine education in your living room. So hybridity, which is a weird idea, COVID-19 has pushed it into a foundational idea, something we must create. The second shift, one is towards well-being hybridity. The second is the anticipatory, the illuminated city. Nation states are big, but we act in our local areas, in our communities. A Japanese city is trying to develop AI to prevent youth suicide, using artificial intelligence to create healthier people. We're trying to imagine a city of an internet of things and people and emotions. Protect the vulnerable, create far more connected people so we feel less isolated. When working with the government of Egypt, they started to imagine, well, instead of bringing in AI for the rich, what would it look like if the poorest of the poor had access to connective technologies? Wouldn't that create an industrial revolution, a dramatic revolution? Not for the wealthiest, but the poor have access to pricing, to climate change, so they're not gypped, duped, conned by the middleman who takes all the profit. This is a weak signal. They made it emerge. We're trying to see it. Lithuania says, well, we feel more secure when we're connected. They're developing what's called city-to-city portals. So throughout the city, you have these portals and you can see citizens in other cities. So as we feel alone, how do we connect? How do we rethink space and time for deeper connections? Now, none of this is possible without distributed energy systems. Working with the largest energy provider in Queensland, Australia, in Malaysia, in a whole range of countries, the one thing they've all said, we must move to solar. We must move to renewable. We must find ways to have peer-to-peer energy exchange. That will create far more efficiency and move us out of fossil fuel. This was a crazy idea 20 years ago, but we're seeing the shift. It's a new decentralized system and it must be integrated. With one board I was working with one large company, we started to make that shift. On the last meeting, the CEO got nervous. He goes, yeah, but we'll lose our funding from fossil fuels. And the head of the board, she just stood up and said, make it so. I'm not interested in any more excuses. We're going to make the shift. You will make the shift. The fourth pivot we're seeing, and again, we're looking at weak signals, is challenging who is in the room. So one of the largest scientific establishments in Australia is that our problem is, even though we're leading, we're still white buildings, white coats, and white labs. So the way forward is diversity of funding, diversity of thinking, and diversity of people. New ideas, robust ideas, greater efficiency, and it challenges our thinking. As the head of the UN said, we're all in this together. And of course, someone is saying, well, given that vaccines are only available for the wealthy, are we in this together? So these are weak signals and they're being challenged. The fifth pivot, of course, is towards meditation and mindfulness. Whether it's lockdowns, feeling insecure, where does deep security come from? And we know, yes, from a better physical world, yes, from a better social world, but clearly from a better inner world. Our ability to slow down, to stop and breathe. And we know the scientific research on the positive outcomes it leads to. And all this presentation will be made available, so I'm not going to go deep into the data there. So as much as I'm suggesting there's some pivots for a better world, remembering Judy Harlov-Chak, the ocean stretched before her like a symbol of life, of endless possibilities. Unfortunately, she'd overlooked the fact that Freddy Krueger was on board. So we know there's anxiety, we know there's fear. We know 1 billion people will die from tobacco-related causes this century. It will be the biggest planetary genocide in human history. This will occur, and we know why it's going to occur. The imagination of what's health. People not believing the science. Only 25% of the Chinese population believes smoking is bad for your health. So as we're imagining this better world, we know the reality of this other world. We know the revenge of Gaia, unless we change our relationship with wildlife, with wet markets, with livestock. We know what the world in the next 50 years will look like. So we have to transform that as well. The third is the global compact. Our problems are planetary, our solutions are national. In the short term, they work. In the long run, we must have planetary solutions. WHO only gives advice, WHO can't implement. In cases like COVID-19, the solutions can only be planetary. The weakest link ensures the virus will spread over and over. As my colleague Peter Black says, the defense can be broken with ease unless everyone has well-being and health. And the final part of our challenge, the Freddy Krueger world, is our energy needs are infinite. For greater standard of living, for physical health, for housing, for food, etc. But our energy systems are fossil fuel. So we have to make the shift towards a global governance with global energy unified systems. To do that, of course, we're back to 3 levels of security and 3 journeys. So in terms of economic futures, let's start to imagine the next 40 years. Today, we were in the world of invisible hand. Trust the markets. We're very clear the markets don't always work. So we create the visible hand, stakeholder capitalism, bring in more people, bring in employees, bring in nature, not just capital. That creates the next level. As we go forward, the new club by 2050, the quadruple bottom line, prosperity, purpose, people, planet, and the metaphor of the shared hands working together. This becomes a far more profound way to run a world economy. By 2070, if we're lucky, we'll enter magical hands with mudras, meaning almost a Star Trek economy with abundance. So that's physical security. Then there's security through society. The fear of nuclear weapons, the fear of attacks from other countries. And of course, our reality is we don't notice those things, but everyone notices power over us, bureaucracy, petty tyrants using whims to regulate us. Every organization has that group, because we still have organizations run by laws and rules, community and well-being. So second thing is developing coordinated power between us, not power over. Of course, this leads to the most profound inner security, meditation or prayer or whatever practice you do. And clearly the research is very clear, connection to nature. And finally, it's connection to spirit. So in my imagination, there's the Sufi, the world is changing dramatically, but she is in total center, in total contemplation, and total stillness. So physical security, social security, and inner security. And if we fail in this, creating the 3 levels of security, what Sarkar says, the Renaissance in 3 years of life, then we're back to fragmentation. A world fragmented by pandemics, fragmented by climate change, fragmented by tribalism, and fragmented by fascism. Whether it's Trump, the old Trump in the US, Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Modi in India, these are people who fragment, they use narrative to push people apart. Our goal is higher evolution, higher complexity, to put us all together on a shared purpose. So ultimately, there's 3 journeys. Remember Campbell, he talked about the hero's journey. My colleague Ivana Miloch is saying, but that's just for men. What's the heroine's journey is far more cooperative. But at the very least, there's 3 journeys forward. Power over the material world. Can we create that? The outer journey. There's power between groups, the shared group journey, what Sarkar calls coordinated cooperation. And there's power within the mastery of the selves, the inner journey. All 3 are critically important. All 3 we have to embark on. If we do that well, we start to go towards deeper connection. All of a sudden, this put together a restructured system. This is our imagination going out 30, 40, 50 years, and a renaissance takes 30, 40, 50 years. We're in the middle of it, we've started, and I'm hoping as I start in the beginning, this is a renaissance of the self and a renaissance of society. As my mother used to always tell me, trust in Allah and tie your camel. As the great global teacher Sarkar says, subjective approach, come with your personal inner world and adjust the external world to start to ensure we move forward. Thanks so much for your time. Exactly 20 minutes.